Psalm 145 is a hymn of praise and the final acrostic psalm in the book of Psalms. It is part of a larger group of psalms often referred to as the Tehillim or songs of praise. Written by King David, this psalm is a powerful declaration of God's greatness and active involvement in the lives of his people. Psalm 145 is considered a wisdom psalm because it teaches about God's attributes and his providential care. It was likely used in communal worship and personal prayer, affirming God's sovereignty and goodness across generations. I will exalt you, my God the King. I will praise your name forever and ever. David begins with personal and perpetual devotion. Referring to God as the King underscores his sovereignty over all creation. The act of exalting God reminds us of the importance of intentional worship. In a world where people are easily distracted by personal ambitions and fleeting achievements, this verse calls Christians to refocus on the eternal and actively choose praise. We can make prayer a daily practice to maintain our connection with God. All your works praise you, Lord. Your faithful people extol you. Here, David transitions from personal praise to communal worship. The works include creation, which inherently glorifies God, and faithful people who consciously declare his goodness. This verse teaches the importance of community in worship. In today's isolated society of Zoom and YouTube worship, believers are encouraged to gather. Physically being present to worship fosters a profound sense of community as shared prayers, songs, and fellowship create emotional bonds, mutual encouragement, and a tangible reminder of God's design for unity among his people. They tell of the glory of your kingdom and speak of your might. David emphasizes God's kingdom, a recurring theme that signifies God's rule over both the physical and spiritual realms. His might reflects his power to deliver and sustain his people. Believers today are called to declare God's glory through evangelism and testimony. Sharing how God's kingdom is evident in our lives encourages others and strengthens faith in his active presence. Next, our lesson highlights the universal scope of God's kingdom. David envisions a world where all nations recognize God's power and beauty. Christians are reminded of the Great Commission, sharing God's love and truth with those who have not experienced it. This verse challenges us to think globally and compassionately in a climate that seems to want to shut doors and not welcome others. Your kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and your dominion endures through all generations. David acknowledges God's eternal reign, contrasting human kingdoms that rise and fall. This verse reassures us that God's kingdom remains unshaken. It provides hope and perspective amidst modern chaos. God's compassion shines here, revealing his care for the weak, fallen, and burdened. This reflects his mercy and willingness to intervene in human struggles. When we face failure or hardship, this verse reminds us that God is not distant. It encourages believers to turn to him for strength and restoration. The eyes of all look to you, and you give them their food at the proper time. You open your hand and satisfy the desires of every living thing. David emphasizes God as the provider of both physical and spiritual nourishment. This reflects his reliability and timing. This highlights God's generosity and the abundance of his provision. His open hand contrasts human tendencies toward greed and withholding. Christians are called to mirror God's generosity in their communities and recognize that he satisfies the deeper desires of the heart. In our effort not to judge people, we live in a world that promotes moral relativism, the idea that there is no universal or absolute set of moral principles. And David proclaims God's justice and faithfulness is the unchanging standard of righteousness, while that does not justify us becoming Christian elitists. Rather, as sinners, that should prompt us to be more forgiving. In fact, David proclaims what God has for him is available for all. God's accessibility is a recurring theme. Our nearness depends on sincere prayer and faith. Christians are reminded of the importance of authenticity in their relationship with God. In a world of superficiality, we are encouraged to seek Him with genuine hearts, and He will grant access to each of us. David concludes with assurance of God's protective love and ultimate justice. He calls for unending worship, underscoring God's worthiness. These verses challenge us to trust God's plan, seek His justice, and live lives of praise. Even in adversity, we are called to glorify Him. Psalm 145 is a call to recognize God's sovereignty amidst life's uncertainties and to live out their faith in a way that reflects His love and power. That's the lesson for this week. Have a great week.